So good evening. I propose we start very slowly to make sure that people still have time to join little by little with the time of the introduction. I'll start by introducing myself. So I'm Laetitia Sedou. I'm the EU project officer at the European Network Against Arms Trade, so the organization now launching the report today. ENAAT is an informal network of grassroots peace groups which work together in research, in advocacy, and campaigning on the arms trade and on the impact of this arms trade on peace and development. And we have about 22 members across 14 European countries, and that means not only EU. I'm very happy to welcome you all for this launch event of this report, and I will start with a few practical points. Maybe I think you know, because you've received a lot about it, that this event is being recorded, and we will put it online on our YouTube channel later on. So you may consider turning off, of course, your camera if you prefer so. Also, because we are in a conference format, please make sure you have your microphone turned off if you don't talk. At the moment of the Q&A session, we encourage you, of course, to take the floor by raising your hand, your virtual hand, of course, at the bottom of your screen. But feel free, of course, to put your question also in the chat if that's more convenient for you. So we have three great speakers today. We have Akkerman and Chloé Meulewaeter. They are the two authors of the report, and we have Bram Vranken from Corporate Europe Observatory. Maybe I should also quickly mention that ENAAT has an EU project that we started in 2016 when the first concrete proposals to use the EU for the arms industry were made. And as you know, by then many things happened, and today we have an 8 billion worth defense funds. We have new instruments being adopted recently, such as this ASAP, which is about boosting ammunition production. We have increased civil-military synergies, which diverts civilian resources to the military. Of course, we have this now famous and alleged or ill-named peace facility. Since our project, we've been vocal against the influence of the arms industry on those related policies and about the close ties they have with EU decision makers, which makes sense, so gives sense also to our report. Now, before we dig more into the report, well, today is 7th of December, and I would like to spare a special thought for all the victims of war and armed violence, and particularly those in Ukraine and, of course, those in Palestine and Israel. The dramatic situation we see in Palestine and Ukraine may make our event look somehow insignificant, but I think, on the contrary, it's highly topical, because it is even more important today to remind that at the back front, or at the back of the war fronts, where you have always one winner, which is the arms industry. And this is not just an unintended consequence of war. That's what our report shows. The fact that the arms industry is playing a proactive role in promoting security and military solutions to political and societal challenges, including today taking advantage of the climate change urgency. So our report dates from end of September, because at some point you need to stop writing, but we could have been going on writing it, because every month, if not every week, we see new declarations or new piece of information that demonstrate, if still needed, the level of influence of the arms industry on European leaders. And that's what we're going to try to show, at least a small perspective of it today. Two very recent examples, and I will finish there, is that the EU Ministers of Defense on 14th of November, they gathered at EU level and called for, I quote, strengthening the defense sector's access to finance, and that includes sustainable finance. And then last week, the EU Defense Agency held its annual conference, gathering arms industry leaders, EU officials, militaries. And there we could see that sustainability criteria were rather presented as obstacles to the development of the arms industry. So it's now time to go deeper into our report, and our speakers will develop further those indicative points. And I will present the speakers as long as they speak. So our first speaker will be Mark Akkerman. He's a researcher at Stop Wapenhandel, the Dutch campaign against arms trade. He's working on arms trade, on the arms industry, its lobby, on border militarization and EU funding and policies in this regard. Stop Weapon Handle and Mark in particular have co-written many reports on those issues, often in cooperation with ENAAT or with the transnational institutes. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Letitia. Let me try to share my screen. Yeah, actually, I was going to pick up almost right where you left, because there's also something that's after we finished writing the report. At the end of October, the European Commission launched a consultation process for an upcoming European defense industrial strategy, a new plan to boost the European arms industry. And this process includes talks with stakeholders, especially the arms industry, as Commissioner for the Defense Industry, Thierry Breton, mentions, which was echoed just last week by President von der Leyen in a speech at this meeting at the European Defense Agency. And while the text of our new report was already finished before these announcements, this new vehicle to support the arms industry is exemplary for the course of the EU in recent years. Our report uncovers the intensive lobby efforts from the EU arms industry and how receptive EU and national policy makers and institutions are to these, creating increasingly close ties between them and resulting in policies that in many aspects follow the wishes of the industry. This is not something new, as the previous report written a couple of years ago by Bram, who is also going to speak later, already showed, but the process has been sped up, in particular since the Russian invasion in Ukraine from last year on. An important development that helped foster these close ties between the EU and industry is the creation of a special European Commission Directorate General for Defense Industry and Space, a UNICAM, because it's the only industry for which a Directorate General to support it has been established. Commissioner Breton and high-ranking officials of this directorate are important targets for arms industry lobbyists. So as you can see on the screen, the large EU arms companies and their lobby organizations have had many meetings with both the Commission and members of the European Parliament. And while not all meetings are about explicit military subjects, as many of these companies are also active on civil markets, it shows the increasingly close relations. At those meetings and in many other lobby efforts, the arms industry puts forward many points and proposals to serve its interests. Key points among these that keep recurring are, not surprisingly, the request for more money, higher military budgets, more arms purchases, more investments in research and in production capacity building, money based on long-term commitments, also an easing of arms export rules, better access to private money, also in the context of rather circumventing sustainable finance, which Chloé will tell more about, and the support of these points, more involvement in policy making. One way in which the Commission has more widely opened its doors to industrial influence has been the establishment of a permanent dialogue with dozens of arms companies and lobby organizations via the Commission Expert Group on policies and programs relevant to EU space, defense and aeronautics industry. This platform basically functions as an open invitation to arms companies to put forward requests and demands and air grievances and complaints, which even now they never have a shortage of. It's clear the EU listens to them. For all the key lobby points that I've mentioned, we have seen the EU cater to the industry's wishes. Most important by creating a string of new funding mechanisms, such as the European Defence Fund, the Act in support of ammunition production, and the European Defence Industry Reinforcement through Common Procurement Act. Through these billions are thrown at the arms industry for military research, the development of new weapons and military technologies, and an increase in production capacities. The success of the arms industry lobby efforts is a general process, but you also see it reflected on concrete points. As an example, At one of the meetings of the expert group, the industry complained, as it did in other instances, about the burden environmentally and socially oriented measures according to it place on it, framing it as an obstacle to increasing its production. And see, what can you read in the regulation for the Act in Support of Ammunition Production? I quote, member states should consider using defense-related exemptions under national and applicable union law. If they deem that the use of such exemptions would facilitate the achievement of the objective of ramping up munition production, which could in particular apply to union law concerning environmental, health and safety issues, because the implementation of that law could produce regulatory barriers, hampering the union defense industry's potential to ramp up the production and deliveries of relevant defense products. It is a collective responsibility for the union and its member states to urgently look into any action they could take to mitigate possible obstacles. In other words, forget about the environment, about climate change, and about health and safety of workers and the general population, because we want to produce more arms. And one of the main results of all these policies to support the arms industry is bound to be an increase in arms exports to non-EU countries. To be more precise, this is also the aim of these policies. While they are presented mainly as necessary for European security, which in itself I think is both highly questionable and undesirable, the objective that is listed on top for all these instruments is strengthening the competitiveness of the EU arms industry. In other words, a better position on the global military and security market. Again, this is something that has been pushed by the industrial lobby. It was something that was, for example, already an important part of the proposal of the industry-dominated group of personalities for the European Defence Fund, which has largely been followed in the eventual regulation for it. And it is something that is regularly confirmed by the European Commission, as continuous talking point of both Commissioner Breton and High Representative Borrell, and important MEPs, such as the chair of the specific subcommittee on defense and security, Loiseau. The easing of arms export rules, a process which is in development on the EU and national level, aids further to this. And as you can see, over the last decade, the oppressive war crimes committing and human rights violating regime of Saudi Arabia was the top destination for EU arms exports. And in many other instances, war, international conflict, repression, human rights abuse, poverty, and climate change have also been fueled by European arms. This will, without any doubt, increase in the coming years. And this is what the current host of new policies and support instruments for the EU arms industry will actually mean. More profit for arms producers and their shareholders, more arms for authoritarian regimes and warmongers, more power for the policymakers who act as lapdogs for the industry, at the cost of more deaths, violence, destruction, repression, and an increasing climate crisis around the world, for which poor, marginalized and repressed communities, most in the global south and most non-white, will pay by far most of the price. So I hope that that our new report will also function as a call to action to stand up against the unprecedented militarization we are witnessing now and against the military-industrial complex that is driving it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Now we will continue with Chloé. I'll let you just maybe unshare your screen. So Chloé, she's a researcher at the De La Center for Peace Studies. It's a Barcelona-based organization, also a member of ENAAT. And the Centro de las analyses armed conflicts, militarism, and militarization. And Chloé in particular works on military spending, on security studies, and on the link between militarism and the climate crisis. Chloé, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laetitia, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to start presenting my part of the ENAAT report that focuses on the greenwashing strategy of the military industry to access sustainable finances. But before we begin, it's worth discussing the framework we've been in for the past few years. So in the context of the climate crisis, the 2030 agenda and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the European Union adopted an action plan on sustainable finances in 2018. And the goal was to establish a strategy for greater interconnection between finance and sustainability. So the EU asked a group of technical experts on sustainable finance to develop a European taxonomy to provide a clear definition of environmental sustainable economic activities. This taxonomy was approved in 2020, focusing only on the environmental aspects of ESG criteria for sustainable finance. And the EU then asked the expert group to work on a social taxonomy to determine what constitutes socially sustainable activity. The military industry lobby then began working to be recognized as a socially sustainable industry. And for this, a greenwashing strategy was developed aiming to establish a link between security and sustainability. Specifically, the arms lobby claimed that security is a precondition for any sustainability. And from 2021 onwards, we see statements from various European lobbies, including the ESD, the main European lobby, and other national lobbies. Also, executives in the European military industry made statements in the press, creating this new narrative. And they argue that the defense industry is essential for global stability, that it contributes to well-being and sustainable development, and is indispensable for achieving decarbonization goals by 2050. The industry attempts to position itself as a legitimate player in sustainability and global stability, disregarding the significant ecological footprint generated by both the industry and military activities. And this is done to access EU sustainable finance sources. But why do we say this is greenwashing? Well, because it is a communication strategy that presents only part of the reality, omitting relevant information. In this case, information about the military ecological footprint is ignored, and the communication focuses exclusively on how the military industry supposedly contributes to global sustainability. However, this is debatable given the military industry, given that the military industry by its nature generates death and destruction and contributes to the climate crisis through CO2 emissions from weapons, toxins from weapon production and armed conflicts, and damage to ecosystems during military activities. But returning to the military lobby's reaction in the context of the European taxonomy, especially after the publication of the expert group's social taxonomy report in 2022, we observe the industry's dissatisfaction. Indeed, the report equates the military industry with other industries harmful to society, such as tobacco or gambling. In response, the industry intensified efforts to convey the message that security is a prerequisite for any sustainability to European institutions and high-ranking European political representatives. The military lobby's narrative even appears in official European documents, such as the Strategic Compass, which is the European Action Plan on Security and Defense. In that document, we see that it urges that EU sustainability efforts might not compromise security and strategic autonomy goals. Also, Ursula von der Leyen, Charles Michel, and active European commissioners in the security and defense context, such as Thierry Breton, echo this narrative. For example, Breton assured the arms industry that the European Social Taxonomy report, as it stands, will not see the light of day. The influence of the military lobby is also evident in the debate on defense financing within the European Investment Bank. Historically, the bank has been reluctant to finance arms-related activities, but recently there has been a shift toward greater flexibility, especially for dual-use projects. But as the mandate of Oye, the current head of the BEI, comes to an end, it remains to be seen if the exclusion of investing in weapons and ammunition production will survive his term. I'll just say Commissioner Thierry Breton is supportive of expanding the bank's mandate to allow financing defense projects. It is also worth noting that the Ukraine war has been an event that the military industry did not anticipate in its greenwashing strategy, and it is now benefiting from it. The conflict has reactivated the militarization of the European Union, removing barriers to increases in national military budgets and funding for the arms industry. The industry has used this moment to express concern about restrictions on access to sustainable finances. For example, a letter from Éric Trappier, which is the executive of Dassault, a letter to the French Minister of the Armed Force highlights the industry's increasing difficulties in dealing with banks and investment funds regarding the application of ESG criteria. And while some banks previously applied ESG criteria and denied some few sources of funding to the military industry, these constraints seems to be loosening since the start of the Ukraine war. Actually, according to Sylvie Matelli, the deputy director of the IRIS think tank, the war in Ukraine presents a real opportunity to renew dialogue between financial actors and the defense industry. However, not all banks are relaxing the application of ESG criteria. Ethical banks, for example, continue to refrain from financing any arms industry. So in conclusion, we can say that the greenwashing strategy of the military industry lobby is working. The new narrative that establishes a link between security and sustainability is reaching the highest European political spheres, permitting official EU documents and succeeding in removing barriers to investment in the arms industry. The final text of the European social taxonomy to be approved by the Commission remains to be seen, but all indications are pessimistic. Possibly only arms production prohibited by international treaties will be excluded from sustainable finances. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chloé. Don't be sorry, it's not your fault to have to announce such bad news. Okay, now let's turn to Bram as our third intervention before we can open the discussion. So Bram is a researcher and campaigner at Corporate Europe Observatory, which is a Brussels-based lobby watchdog, and he is working there on the big tech lobbying. He recently co-published with l'Observatoire des Multinationales the report Blood on the Green Deal, so we saw a very good connection here with our own reports. Bram previously worked with the Belgian peace organization Vredesactie, also a member of ENAAT, where he campaigned against the Belgian and European arms trades, the lobbying of the arms industry, and EU militarization. And Bram has been the author of the first report on arms lobbying that we have been building on for our new reports. Bram, please.
Okay, thanks. I will share my screen. Hopefully it will work. Okay, can people see this? Is this working? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, yes.
So I will zoom in on a very specific act which has recently been approved, and it's called the Critical Raw Materials Act. What that does is the aim of that act is to make access to critical raw materials, to resources such as copper, nickel, cobalt, and other resources easier. That means both in Europe as well as elsewhere. And officially, the reason for this act is to guarantee the green transition, because for example, electric cars or solar panels need resources, and there is a perceived lack of resources, so mining has to be increased. Additionally, Europe wants to be less dependent on countries outside of the European Union. The downsides, of course, is that mining is a very dirty activity, and what the Critical Raw Materials Act does is essentially weakening certain environmental and human rights standards. Which is all like, so there is already a lot of criticism from the environmental and climate movement that this is actually not a green legislation, that this is not helpful in guaranteeing the green transition, but actually matters are even worse. So what we have seen and what we have documented in the report is that the Critical Raw Materials Act has been cynically used by the arms industry to make sure that certain materials, raw materials, which have nothing to do with the green transition, are included in the Critical Raw Materials Act. So I will quickly go through some of the tactics the defense industry has been using to bring its message across and to be successful in its lobbying offensive. And tactic one is hitting the same nail over and over again. So I've seen a long-standing lobby objective of the arms industry to make access to raw materials easier. So already in 2013, we see that the European Commission mentions access to raw materials as crucial to the defense industry. And this was again picked up in the European Defense Action Plan in 2016, which was shortly published after the group of personalities, which has already been mentioned, published a report. In the Defense Action Plan, again, the need for the defense industry to access these raw materials is stressed. And curiously, the European Defense Action Plan mentions a report, but when looking at that report, it mentions that the report has been based on input from several defense industries, including Airbus. So already the objective to make access to raw materials easier was based on a study which relied on the defense industry. So tactic two is meetings. So it has already been mentioned, the arms industry has substantial lobby budgets, but even more interesting is when looking at Airbus. Airbus is one of the biggest European arms companies, and is incredibly influential when it comes to lobbying. So if you look at Airbus in terms of meetings, they have the second highest amount of meetings with high-level EU officials, and only Google has more meetings with the European Commission and Airbus. It's not only with European Commission they meet with ambassadors, they meet with heads of state, with prime ministers, with ministers. So by being everywhere at the same time, they are very effective in getting their message across. There are also just very shady lobby groups where it's unclear or it's very obscure how they work and what is being said. But for example, the Kangaroo Group is a long-standing and a lobby group which brings MEPs, members of the European Parliament, together with industry, specifically the arms industry. And we also found documentation that one of the topics they discussed was access to raw materials. The Sky and Space Intergroup is another one. It's so an intergroup is sort of a group in Parliament where members of the European Parliament across party lines can meet on a specific issue, which could be a good thing, you know, so they can come to certain compromises or come to a certain position. But the thing is, with the Sky and Space Intergroup, that's an intergroup which is hosted by the ASD, which is the most important lobby organization for the defense industry, and represents all like most big European arms industries, and has been called by the CEO of ASD, Jan P, as a very an extremely efficient way of engaging MEPs. So fourth, as a tactic, is expert groups. And one expert group has already been mentioned, and that's a permanent dialogue group, which has been set up by Thierry Breton, who is famous for, or infamous for, being extremely close to the arms industry. And what the permanent dialogue group is supposed to do is to make sure that the views of the arms industry are taken care of. The second expert group, which is especially relevant when it comes to the Critical Raw Materials Act, is an expert group on raw materials, where again the ASD is a member of. So these expert groups are, of course, extremely efficient in lobbying policymakers, because they provide advice even before a piece of legislation is, or a proposal is, made by the European Commission and is under consideration by, for example, the European Parliament. And lastly, what was really stunning to see was the amount of insider help the arms industry got for pushing through what it wanted on the Critical Raw Materials Act. So we have somebody from the DG Defense Industry, which is a Directorate General, like a ministry within the European Commission, where somebody said, we are the voice, we are the defense industry voice within the Commission to highlight the need of the defense industry to make sure that the Critical Raw Materials Act is not only about economic and green considerations, although they are very important, we must also take into account the security dimension. So that gives a bit of an insider's view of how the arms industry got help from within certain parts of the European Commission. But of course, Thierry Breton was very influential in pushing through this position. For example, I copied in this quote of him where he says, "No batteries without lithium, no wind turbines without rare earths, no ammunition without tungsten." So it wasn't only the Commission, also the European Defense Agency was quite influential, or was pushing to get certain raw materials included in the act. And France and Spain were also especially vocal about pushing the interests of the industry. So this was quite successful. So initially, the arms industry or defense applications were not included as a reason to include raw materials in the Critical Raw Materials Act, but that changed with the introduction of a new category, and that category was called the strategic raw materials, and had as the explicit aim to include defense applications. Also, what also was one of the lobbying successes of the defense industry was the including aluminium and titanium to the list of these strategic raw materials. So both aluminium and titanium have limited use for the green transition, but are crucial resources or raw materials for example, building fighter jets and other defense applications. For example, aluminium is extremely damaging, is very toxic. It's mostly mined in outside of Europe, for example, in the Amazon forest. So by including these materials to the Critical Raw Materials Act, it is guaranteed that that the EU will try to have more access to these materials and have less consideration for environmental standards and for human rights standards. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Thanks a lot, Bram. So I think it gives quite a wide picture and not very optimistic, I'm afraid, but of the different aspects of this lobbying. So I will now just open the floor directly for the debate. So feel free to put questions either in the chat or to raise your hand. Normally I should see you quite easily for questions, but also for comments, for complementing information that you may have. Giving some hopes. I don't know if any positive information. Okay. In the meantime, maybe if there is no question yet, no comment, I don't see any. Maybe I will just put a few ones so that it maybe launch a bit the debate. Bram, because we ended with you, I might maybe have one question for you. I was wondering if you see any specificity in the lobbying which is conducted by the arms industry compared with other sectors. Anything different or prominent or?
Unfortunately, I have to say that that arms industry lobbying is extremely efficient, and that with relatively modest resources, they have been able to really capture the agenda. And it is really stunning to see what has happened in the last couple of years. I don't think there is any industry which has had so many successes as the arms industry, including having a DG, a Director General, just for supporting the industry, the DG DIFIS, being able to open up so many pots of money, weakening legislation, getting money on the table. If I compare that with, for example, big tech, where I'm also working on, big tech is spending millions and millions of euros to lobby the institutions. They're spending a lot more on lobbying the EU than the arms industry, but they are in the defensive, and the arms industry is really in the offensive, and that is dramatic to see.
Okay, I shouldn't have the question. I shouldn't have put the question. Wow. Sometimes you think that because you're focused on that, that's why you feel so problematic. But yeah, okay, Samuel, please.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Really interesting and depressing report. Question, I suppose, is primarily for Chloé, but whoever else, which is, how do we push back against this sustainability argument? Maybe not with the EU Commission, because they're clearly not listening, but with, for example, financial institutions, that they are organizations that can be lobbied, that are sensitive potentially to public pressure. Is the key argument to make the one about the carbon footprint of the industry and military activities in general? Is it about the arms exports, the sort of clear worst cases, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the effect that those have? Is it about the whole security and sustainability narrative as a whole? What is actual security? What sort of security is needed for sustainability, and what gives us that? Yeah, so what do you see as the key way of pushing back on this?
Okay, so thank you for your question, Sam, and I wish I had a very good answer for that question, because this is the main point. Yes, I think that central to the debate is what we understand for security. And I mean, from social movement, we have to create our own narrative on what security is, and I think we have to make our that word. I mean, why do they talk about security, and why do we speak about human security or common security or sustainable security? Maybe we should just talk about security because we can't appropriate this word from pacifist movement. So I think I would start speaking about, as we do today, about security from our perspective without adding another word to it. And then yes, we have to keep working on alternatives, and one of these alternatives is ethical banking, of course, ethical finance, and you know, from the Center de las, we try to push research and to inform people about ethical banking. To make it more powerful, so people know it exists, because as we say in the report, this is the only one actually not investing in the arms industry. And also the work on the military ecological footprint is very, very important. And there is, I've seen Stuart, I think, in the Zoom room. He knows much more than me about it, and we have to keep working on that. I wish I had a better answer to your question, but I'm afraid that is what I can say.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chloé. Marnie?
Hi there, thank you very much. And thanks to the speakers for all the information and that's in the report. My question was that given that there will be a presentation of the defence industry, the European militarization of Europe, which has so dramatically increased since the war in Ukraine, early next year, I was wondering whether, as part of the pushback against that, there was any plans to target the European elections on this basis, which will be happening in the first quarter of next year, because it is just so dramatic what is going on, and the information that you have is so alarming in lots of ways that I wonder whether we couldn't use the European elections for this. I should have said I'm from the Irish anti-war movement and the Irish Neutrality League, and we are finding even Ireland, with its tradition of neutrality, is increasingly singing the EU tune on questions concerning militarization. Thank you.
Thank you, Marnie. I suggest we take also the question from Ricardo, and we can maybe then join answers from different persons, and including the audience could react to the questions from the others. Ricardo, please.
Hi, thanks for this. Well, my question was just about data. Since I've read in the report you talk about more than 150 meetings with MPs of the European Parliament, organized by the top 10 EU companies, defense companies. And but in the new link you sent, Leida, I see these meetings are quoted 175. So I was just wondering which number is the correct one. And the other question was, how can we estimate? How much is 150 meetings? How much does it count in comparing to the other lobby activity in Europe? Is it Is it a lot, or is it quite normal in I mean, in the European Union to have 100 meetings in 5 years, maybe? So I was just, yeah. Thank you.
Maybe Mark and Bram, you may be more able to respond to Ricardo's question, and then I don't forget yours, Marnie, and if no one else wants to react, we will also jump on yours.
Yeah, about the number of meetings. In the report there's a more detailed overview with the number per company, and also for ASD and EOS. That counts up to 175. I have to say, sometimes there are meetings where several companies are present at once. So that's how we came to about 150 meetings in total, I think. I haven't looked at other sectors, so I don't know if it's much, but I guess it is quite much. I mean, if I see that Airbus has almost 18 meetings on its own with MEPs in 5 years, that's, I think, quite a lot. But yeah, maybe that's something Bram knows more about.
It's well, what I first have to say about the number of meetings is that it's always an underestimation. So, for example, if you look at the meetings with the European Commission, there is only information about meetings with high-level officials. And what does that mean? That means that we have information about meetings with only 300 EU officials within the Commission, while there are 30,000 people working for the Commission. So we only have a glimpse of the true amount of meetings. As I mentioned, Airbus has the second highest amount of meetings with the European Commission. So it is definitely a big player. On the Parliament, also, again, it's an underestimation. In reality, there are way more. A lot of members of the European Parliament don't report about the meetings they have. And there is little, although in some cases they are obliged to report about these meetings, they don't always do. So it's an underestimation. But what I think is that for the arms industry, probably it's also more worthwhile to target the Commission and national governments, because they have more leeway with those institutions. They have historical connections dating back decades. A lot of revolving doors of people who work for government go to the arms industry, back again. So that might also explain why they might focus on, for example, one institution more than another. But it's difficult to say about just on the basis of these numbers. But I would definitely say it's a substantial amount of meetings.
Many thanks, Bram. I will come back to Marnie's question also, because you may have seen that in the chat we also have one comment and question which is relating to Marnie's question. Michael Herman is asking if the peace and anti-arms trade movement shouldn't become more politicized, in particular because, well, in influencing the Commission, or the Commission cannot really do so much, especially compared with the level of lobbying, and that with European elections, also the idea of working maybe more to the level of the parties and governments. And that's a very good point. Now, of course, I can only speak more on behalf of ENAAT, but the fact is that ENAAT, we are not really so much a lobby group, to be honest. First, because of lack of means, because we is only one permanent staff part-time in Brussels. So that reduces a lot what we can do. And it's true that we are now trying a bit more to be more on raising awareness, working towards journalists, media, other civil society. But of course, the limited means we have means that for a month or so, we couldn't do really more as ENAAT than just this report. because of the limited means we have. But that's definitely an issue we have in mind. There is a lot of, many ENAAT members are connecting more and more with the climate movement, for example, to connect this climate and peace issue together. So that's also one reason, I think, why there is more and more interest and paper and research of different kinds about this issue of the environmental impact of the arms industry and how this affects climate, but also peace, and how the two connects together. So I think on that sense, it's going well. Most ENAAT members are working more at national level than they do at EU level. But of course, it's only a very small part of the peace group. Another challenge we face, I think, and on that sense, that's also what ENAAT tries to bring to the peace movement, is that where there are many other issues about peace to deal with, especially in the current context. So many other peace movements are not dealing with the industry dimension of it because they just have other urgent issues to deal with. So in that sense, I think ENAAT is one of the peace groups which helps sharing attention and sharing the knowledge about this industrial dimension, which are very different actors than the traditional peace actors. Even at the level of the EU institutions, you don't dialogue with the same people. Usually you don't dialogue at all because they don't really want to dialogue with us, to be honest. But yeah, so indeed it's important, and we hope, and I will stop there. We hope to be able to do things with the elections. We have ideas about it and plans. Now the point will be whether we will find the resources to do it, but that's definitely, I fully agree that it should be raised during the elections. So we'll do our best for it. Sorry, are there other questions or interventions or comments or reactions or maybe also ideas of people who would have plans for the elections? That would be great to know, or national level.
There's another question in the chat.
Sorry, I didn't.
By Sam.
Yeah. So also someone was asking that the arms industry has clearly been given a central inside position in the Brussels corridor. Is this a result of a very successful lobbying, or is it more that the EU, largely due to the interest of the largest member state, have chosen to invite the arms industry into its innermost council, and so enabling the industry to do such effective lobbying? Yeah. What would be the key underlying driving force under it? I don't know if any of you would like to answer to that point.
I can give it a try to answer the question. Maybe Mark and Chloé can add. I think it's of course it's both, but I think one part of the explanation is that governments are seeing the arms industry as strategic partners, and that which automatically gives them a lot of leeway with those governments. So for example, in France, a big part of the arms industry is state-owned. You have ministers who have worked for the industry or who go to the industry afterwards. So it's a very closely knitted ecosystem. And these, for example, it's no coincidence that France is one of the countries with the largest arms industry, and is also the country which has been pushing this process of militarization the hardest. And then, but what is also, of course, the case is that often the defense industry will come up with some kind of policy position, and then they will just keep on hitting on the same nail. So that's what we have seen with the European Defense Fund. Already in the 2000s, the defense industry was lobbying for a specific military research program. There was resistance within the parliament and within the commission. And then they just had to wait for example, you have the ASD, which already said in the 2000s, we need a group of wise men. And then what we see is that in 2016, not so long after the Russian annexation of Crimea, that the Commission starts as group of personality, which later on, gives advice and leads to the establishment of a European Defence Fund funding military research. So there we see how this long-standing presence within the EU bubble also just very, very effective, besides this very closely knit relationship, these very closely knit relationships with national governments.
Mark, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I can only echo that. What you see all the time is that that the European Commission and governments see the arms industry representatives as experts. They are embraced because of their so-called expertise on issues, and they are more seen as experts than as lobbyists that primarily look to serve their own economic interests. And I mean, like Bram said, you saw that with the European Defence Fund. I've studied the whole lobby on border militarization a lot, and there you see it also very clear. That starts with framing migration as a security issue. That's something that's really been pushed by the industry, and once that has happened, as European Commission and others have followed the industry lobby in that and see it as primarily a security problem, then it's also almost logical in their idea that you need a militarized response, that you need the tools that this industry can provide to deal with it. So it's very clear. Both sides, absolutely.
I would just quickly add also one point. I think it's also kind of playing in favor of the arms industry. Also, there is a kind of tension or contradiction between the fact that there is this so-called willingness to do more on defense, but at the same time, there is no political willingness among member states or agreement about what is a European defense or a union on defense, of a Europe of defense, or whatever. You even have three terms to speak about one thing that is never defined. And in the end, of course, because they never really agree about going further towards more integration or majority votes, and I'm not saying it would be good, but in the sense of, really advancing on that, then they always come back to the lowest common denominator they can all agree on, which is put more money on the arms industry, because they can also ask the Commission to do it without losing their control on their strategic defense. So this also plays in favor of the arms industry, also as appearing as the solution each time they cannot agree on anything else but that. And of course, the war in Ukraine has been, from a more kind of context moment, also a key opening for them to justify all their demands, kind of post justification. I see no more questions in the public except in the chat. I think there was, if you allow me a few minutes more, an interesting question from Ruth, which joins a bit the question about the elections and the awareness raising, which is about access to newspaper, because an important point is indeed that the fact that most citizens are not aware that any of this is happening, or not under this format, let's say. So there is a question from Ruth about the possibility to publish this kind of analysis in national newspapers. I don't know if any of you would like to react. I could also comment a bit, but prefer to let you start about how do you see that at national level?
That's difficult, I would say, especially since the start of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. The political and public debate has been very much dominated with a stance pro more military spending, pro support to the arms industry, and it's hard to get attention for the other side. So sometimes we manage, but it's not a lot. I would say I see a bit of shift now with the war in Gaza. Some more critical positions turning up, but I'm afraid as anti-arms trade groups, we are on the defensive at the moment.
Anyone else would like to add something? Bram or Chloé? Yeah, I would just complement what Mark says, because indeed we've been trying more and more with our papers from the EU project to reach out to media, and it's true, it's difficult. There is more and more interest from investigative journalists about that, especially about all these aspects, this kind of dark side about the role of the arms industry. And I think this connection with sustainability and so on is so shocking that it also draws more attention. But it remains complicated, either because of urgent other topics, and usually when we manage to get some visibility is in more kind of leftist newspaper considered as very leftist, which is a good way to start spreading the information, but then reaching to more mainstream media is complicated. But it definitely, I think, is definitely an important target we need to maintain and keep the pressure. Maybe we should do like the industry, you know, keep on tapping on the same nail over and over again with the press rather than with the institutions to try and get that.
Maybe to add, I think, maybe to add to that, I think that's also why this report is so important, because nobody knows what's going on the EU level. It's often an alphabet soup if you talk about all these military programs, and documenting what is happening, how it is happening, and how the arms lobby is operating is just really important in putting them in the spotlight and making it more difficult for them to operate, because the more people know about them, I still believe people think that the arms industry is a nasty industry, that it's an industry which profits from exporting weapons to conflict zones, and is not the answer to our security problems, and is definitely not sustainable. And I think most people know that. I think the problem is that our policymakers have forgotten it. And I think ENAAT and all the groups in ENAAT are doing a super important job in making sure that the critical voice is being heard and is still there. Because if you leave it to the politicians, then we're screwed, so to say.
Thanks a lot, Bram. Thanks to everyone. Is there any other comments, pressing question that people would like to put? Would love to continue the conversation, but I also realize that time is flying and it's quite late in the evening now, or end afternoon. So if there is no other major comments or point, I don't think I missed anyone in the chat. We sent a number of links about this question about the humanitarian and social costs of war. There is indeed a lot of work, I think, on that too, which show that war is much, much more costly than peace, in fact. So I invite you to go to those links if you want to know more about that. Okay, I think I will close there now. I thank you very much. First, thanks to our three great speakers. Thank you a lot for your time and contributions. Thank you so much also to all of you who participated and who were interested despite busy agendas and quite dramatic not actuality, as we say in French, or news, whatever. Well, thank you for continuing following our work on our website, which will be soon improved. I promise it will be much better than it is now. On social media, do not hesitate to contact us for questions, for suggestions, for ideas. We hope to see you again, virtually or in person. Thanks again, and have all a very nice evening. Thank you.